Hello, BookTube. Well, it's Wednesday, and that's New Comic Book Day in the United States, and that ordinarily is the occasion when the forces of Hyde Cottage and stately Vaughan Manor combined for the epic Comic Book Wednesday extravaganza of me and Michael K Vaughan, where he picks some comic, some run, some volume that we're going to talk about on Wednesday, and we do. But I missed last Wednesday. I was gone, and he didn't want to soldier on alone. But he did. He picked a volume, uh, an epic collection, to get back to the roots of Epic Comic Book Wednesday, and I did not join him. So I still have to do that. I still have to do my Epic Wednesday discussion of that particular collection. But he didn't do a new comic today because I am lagging behind. He didn't pick a new thing to double up. Instead, today he did a tag, an original tag. And I didn't do a tag yesterday, and I also feel like I owe him one, so I thought I would do it today. I've got the rad pad all fired up here. It is the Astounding science fiction tag. And I'll leave a link to the original down below. It's all a bunch of questions about science fiction. And I think I have props. Did I bring in props? I did. I brought in a couple of props, so you wouldn't have to just stare at me the whole time. Not that there's anything wrong with that, since I have the skills to pay the bills. But let's get started. Question number one is, what was the first science fiction book that you read, and what did you think of it? I don't actually have it here, but I have something that stands in for it. The first thing that I wanted to say was Princess of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs, the first of the John Carter of Mars stories, where a human is catapulted through mystical means to the planet Mars, where Mars's lower gravity gives him superpowers. He can leap enormous distances. He's much stronger. And he finds a hugely complicated, exotic world on Mars. He doesn't find a dead, blazingly cold, lifeless world like we know exists. Instead, he found the thing was written at the beginning of the 20th century, and he found all the combinations of all of the greatest fantasies of what our heavenly neighbor might be like, and had a number of great adventures. Now, I have these old Del Rey paperbacks. This is John Carter of Mars with that great, just fantastic cover artwork. Just amazing by Michael Whelan cover artwork. There you have an exotic city in the background, one of Mars's moons cresting the horizon. There you have Tars Tarkas, who is a green man of Mars. They have 4 arms and 2 legs and gigantic tusks, which you can just barely make out in this picture. And then in the front, we have John Carter himself, who rises to become a warlord on Mars through his ability and his valor, and behind him is the incomparable Dejah Thoris and another of Mars's moons. This is the last book in the John Carter of Mars series, but it'll definitely stand in for all the others, because once I gobbled down a Princess of Mars, I gobbled down all the others, and I have read the Barsoomian tales so many times. I don't even know how many times I've read them, with favorite books and not favorite books. That stands to reason, but Thuvia, Maid of Mars, is my favorite of the books, but I've read them all countless times. So that was the first, and I loved it. You're supposed to respond with what you think of it, and I loved it. I just loved it, and I still do. Question number 2 is, what was the last science fiction book that you read, and what did you think about it? And here I don't have a prompt. I read Kingdoms of Death by Christopher Rocio, which is the 4th book in his Sun Eater series, and it's easy to see the intelligence. I don't know when it comes out. It might be out already. It's easy to see his intelligence, the intelligence that has guided this book from this series from the beginning. But it's played out. It's a big, thick, involved, very intelligent novel, but this need not have been anything more than a trilogy. I would argue that the Sun Eater could have been one book. I realize, the author's got mortgage payments to build, but I think it's more obvious in this 4th volume than it is in any of the others that this was never meant to be stretched to so many books. On the one hand, what I thought of it was, I thought it was extremely competently done. But on the other hand, on the larger hand, I thought it was extremely competently done as an example of something that shouldn't have been done at all. So I don't know what that'll do for you. Then question number 3 is, if you love science fiction, and I don't know why you'd be doing this tag if you didn't, what made you love science fiction? I had read science fiction for a long time, on and off, before the thing that made me love it. And the thing that made me love it is also all over Michael's version of this tag, like a rash. And that is the original Star Trek. So not a book, or series of books, but a TV show. The original Star Trek that aired a long, long time ago, and that I absolutely fell in love with. And that introduced me not only to loving science fiction as a genre. Up until then, I think if you'd have asked me what I thought the John Carter of Mars books were, I would have said they were sword fighting novels. They're epic sword fights in almost every volume. But I don't think I would have considered them science fiction. I don't think I would have. They are, of course, but I don't think I would have ranked them that way. Star Trek suddenly made me think that way, introduced me to a genre as a genre, and also introduced me to a whole bunch of writers who then went on to other careers. So it's Star Trek for me. It's not a book. It's a TV show. Then question number 4 is, what is your favorite science fiction movie? I want to stress here. Favorite. Right? Not best. Favorite. The one you love the most, whether it's good or bad. Whether it's good or bad. And for me, it's Star Trek 3, The Search for Spock, which I saw during a long, hot summer in Iowa, in a small town in Iowa. It was the only thing of interest that was playing. And I watched every single show. I watched it every single time that it aired. I would go for a long swim in the pool at the gymnasium, and then I would watch Star Trek. Not at first, I might have thought that I was doing it just to soak up the air conditioning, but I eventually did it just because I love that movie. I love everything about it. I probably Stockholm Syndrome took hold fairly early on, so I realized it has its flaws. But if we're going to talk about a favorite science fiction movie, it's not going to be Silent Running. It's not going to be 2001. It's not going to be anything like that. It's just going to be Star Trek: The Search for Spock. Then question number 5 is, what is your favorite science fiction TV show? I'm sorry to be a one-trick pony here, but it's Star Trek, the original Star Trek, even though a lot of it is very bad science fiction. A lot of it is not either. And also, it cares about the science fiction in its own episodes, which no science fiction on TV had done so before, and precious few have done so since. Star Trek actually introduced the idea that not only would you have these outlandish science fiction concepts, but that you would care about them. You would care about their internal consistency. They wouldn't just be magic as a device to get the plot moving along. So it would be Star Trek for me. Then number 6 is, what science fiction book do you feel should be read more often? Here I give my usual disclaimer to should questions. There are no books that should. There is no should. But science fiction as a genre, just in general, tends to treat its progenitors really poorly. Really, really poorly. If you're not Dune, or if you're not currently hot on Netflix, then you have a large chance of falling through the cracks, no matter how great you are. Go to your local retail bookstore in the United States. Go to Barnes & Noble, to your big Barnes & Noble. Go to the science fiction fantasy section, and for a minute pretend that you are not a lifetime fan of the genre. Pretend that you're someone new. That you're an 18-year-old who wants to read new science, who wants to go and see what science fiction has to offer, and maybe doesn't have a very good selection at the library. Maybe the bookstore is the place that you've always gone to find out what a genre has to represent itself. If you go to the science fiction fantasy aisle of most Barnes & Nobles, you will not see Alfred Bester at all. You won't even know that he exists. You will barely see any Ray Bradbury other than Fahrenheit 451. You won't see any Arthur C. Clarke. And those are just the gigantic megawatt names. Everybody else, good luck. You won't see anything like that at all. And the example that I have in mind is Pamela Sergeant, who I would say just in general. I mean, I'm sure that she's completely out of print, but she wrote a lot of great stuff. She is completely forgotten. I won't say should, but if you're a science fiction, a budding science fiction fan, and you're interested in a very, very intelligent author, I would say Pamela Sergeant. Then question number 7 is, what is your favorite science fiction short story? This is very, very tough. I immediately started jotting down titles like Attitude of Earth Toward Other Bodies by James Sallis, which is fairly old but is still just amazing. Or The Women Men Don't See by James Diptree. Or Scanners Live in Vain by Cordwainer Smith. He wrote a lot of more elegant short stories, but I don't think he ever wrote anything more powerful as a short story than Scanners Live in Vain. But for me, if we're talking favorite, again, then I am going to pick a story that doesn't have any science fiction in it. I've mentioned it many times on this channel. I dearly, dearly love it. It's by Howard Waldrop, who is another great science fiction author that science fiction has completely forgotten. So his novel, all of his short stories are all gone. But he wrote a short story called The Ugly Chickens, which is alternate history, which fits under the broader umbrella of science fiction, and it was always in science fiction anthologies. It was anthologized a couple of times. Editors at the time, it came out like 50 years ago, editors at the time knew how great it was and jumped over themselves to include it in every year-end anthology volume. But it isn't technically science fiction. There's no science fiction in it, really, except that it's alternate history. And it starts with a young ornithology graduate student in Texas whose car breaks down. So he has to take the city bus. And he's whiling away the time on the city bus, which is filling up with the black and brown women who clean the mansions of the wealthy in the Texas suburbs. It's filling up with those women in the early morning, and he's on his way to class, and he has a textbook open in front of him. He's not paying attention to his surroundings at all, when suddenly he hears a woman, an older black woman who is a cleaning woman for a mansion on a hill, say to him, "I haven't seen one of those ugly chickens since I was a girl." And the main character looks up at her, and then looks down at the book, and then looks up at her, and then looks down at the book, and realizes the book on his knee is open to a picture of the Mauritius dodo, the most famous extinct bird in the history of the world, that went extinct a long, long time ago. And he says on the bus, he thinks to himself, well, what I should have said to her was, well, no, ma'am, I don't know what you think you're looking at, but you could not possibly have seen this particular bird when you were a child. That is not possible. But instead, she gets off the bus. And a story follows from there. And I have loved it since the moment it appeared. I was hoping that it would show up in anthologies that year, and it did. It showed up in a few of them. It's completely forgotten now, but if we're talking favorites, it's The Ugly Chickens for me. Absolutely. And then question number 8 is, what is your favorite science fiction book? And here, again, I want to stress, we're talking favorites. We're not necessarily talking the best book. There are a long list of books that I could say that are the best science fiction books. And on that list, for me, and for I think pretty much every other science fiction reader, would be Dune by Frank Herbert. But it's God Emperor of Dune that is my favorite science fiction novel. And that is a totally qualified thing to say, because it's a novel that is totally dependent on the novels that come before it, which means that it technically is not a good book. A good book will not be dependent on the books that come before it. This is totally dependent on the books that come before it. But we're talking favorite. It's not only my favorite Dune book, but it's probably my favorite science fiction book. Certainly if you take into account how many times I have reread it. I have read God Emperor of Dune more times even than I have read Norstrilia, also by Cordwainer Smith. I've read it more times than I've read Dune. So as for a favorite, I'm going to say that. And that is the Astounding Science Fiction tag. In his video, Michael just flatly says, "You're tagged." And I echo that. If you read science fiction, if you love science fiction, then do this tag, and I want to hear your answers. But in the meantime, I'm going to wrap this up. I've got a comic book video to make now, don't I? I'll see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.